know angle 2 is 110 degrees, and angle 2 and angle 8 are alternate interior angles, so they're also going to be equal. So if angle 2 is 110, angle 8 is also 110. So just like that, using these definitions, I know that the correct answer is C, 110 degrees. I'm going to put a link to my video on all these definitions in the description of this video. Again, I take my time to discuss the definitions and ins and outs of all these. So please check that out if you struggle with any of the concepts in this short video. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says the absolute value of 13 minus 15 equals. So this is a very easy question that tests your understanding of what absolute value means. And let me just read the definition to you. It says the absolute value of a number or an integer is the actual distance of the integer from 0 in a number line. Therefore, the absolute value is always a positive value and not a negative number. So the absolute value is always going to be positive. Get rid of your negative answer choices. 13 minus 15 is negative 2. That said, the absolute value of negative 2 is simply positive 2. So this one is A. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says if x lies between 1 and 2 but does not equal 1 or 2, which of these is correct? So before we look at our answer choices, let's write the solution to this one ourselves. It says x is somewhere between 1 and 2, but it does not equal 1 or 2. So this is the solution that we're looking for. And now we're going to solve all these answer choices until we find one that matches this. So let's start with A. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy that one down as is to get started. And let's go ahead and solve this one. We solve this inequality by subtracting 1 from both sides. This crosses out. 1 minus 1 is 0. We're left with x in the middle. 2 minus 1 is 1. Does this match this? No, this says x is between 0 and 1, which is not what the question stipulated. Let's go ahead and take a look at D very quickly. We have negative 1, 3 minus 2x, and 1. Let's solve this inequality first by subtracting 3 from both sides. In doing so, this crosses out. Negative 1 minus 3 is negative 4. Of course, we're left with negative 2x in the middle. 1 minus negative 3 is going to be negative 2. Now we're going to solve for x next by dividing everything by negative 2. And the thing you want to pay close attention to is the fact whenever you multiply or divide across an inequality sign by a negative value, that's going to prompt you to change the direction of the sign. In this case, I divided everything by a negative value of 2. So I'm actually going to have to change the direction of these signs, as you can see. Negative 2x divided by negative 2 is just x. Negative 4 divided by negative 2. A negative divided by a negative is going to be a positive, so this is 2. And negative 2 divided by negative 2, again, a negative divided by a negative is a positive, is simply positive 1. Now this says x is between 1 and 2, and that matches exactly what we have up here. In fact, I can actually rewrite this to be just like that. All right, so the correct answer to this one is D. We just had to solve these answer choices until we found the one that more or less matched our solution. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says which of these equations is perpendicular to the line y equals negative 3x plus 2. So first of all, I want to point out that we're looking at a line that's in slope-intercept form. That is y equals mx plus b, where m is your slope. So we can see our slope in this case is negative 3. Now I also want to mention that if two lines are perpendicular, their slopes are negative reciprocals. So in other words, we got to find the negative reciprocal of negative 3. Well, let's first express negative 3 as a fraction by placing it over 1. And to find the reciprocal of negative 3 over 1, we simply exchange our numerator and denominator. So that's going to be 1 over negative 3. So we found the reciprocal of negative 3. But again, they're negative reciprocals of each other. So we're going to tack a negative on there. A negative of a negative, again, a negative times a negative is a positive. So these two negatives become positive. In other words, the negative reciprocal of negative 3 is 1/3. So if we look through our answer choices, only one of them has a slope as positive 1/3. So therefore, we know the correct answer in this case is A. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says evaluate the expression log base 3 of 27 plus log base 6 of 36. Now, truth be told, logarithms don't typically show up on the Asvab very frequently. That said, this question is more of a test of your understanding of exponents rather than logarithms, which is why something like this could potentially show up. All right, so the key here is to look at the inverse logarithmic property, which says log base a of a to the k power is simply equal to k. In other words, we're going to rewrite both of these logarithms such that they mirror this, and then our answer is simply going to be k plus k. And let's go ahead and do that, starting with log base 3 of 27. Now, what can I write 27 as? What can I rewrite it as? Well, 27 is the same thing as 3 to the third power. Again, 3 to the third power is the same thing as 3 times 3 times 3. 3 times 3, as you know, is 9. 9 times 3 is 27. So this is the same thing as log base 3 of 3 to the third power. And according to this inverse logarithmic property, this is simply going to be 3. So I know log base 3 of 27 is the same thing as log base 3 of 3 to the third power, which is the same thing as simply 3. Now let's go ahead and rewrite log base 6 of 36 the same way. We have log base 6. What can I rewrite 36 as? 36 is the same thing as 6 squared. Again, 6 squared is 6 times 6 are 36. And according to the inverse logarithmic property, log base 6 of 6 to the second power is simply going to be 2. In other words, this whole problem is simply 3 plus 2 or 5. So the answer to this one is C5. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says if a line has a slope of m equals 2 and 4, 5 is a point on the line, what is another point on the line? So you could actually solve this one of two ways. You can solve it by graphing, or you can solve it algebraically. And as it happens, I'm going to solve this one algebraically. Again, this is my x, this is my y, and I'm actually going to write an equation of a line using the point slope equation. That is y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1. Again, this is going to be x1, this is going to be y1, and we already know m is 2. So let's plug those values in accordingly. This becomes y minus 5 equals 2 times x minus 4. The next thing we have to do is take this 2 and distribute it here and here. This becomes y minus 5 equals 2 times x, or 2x. 2 times negative 4 is going to be negative 8. And finally, we're simply going to add 5 to the other side of the equation to make this y equals 2x. Negative 8 plus 5 is negative 3. So the equation of our line is right here. It's y equals 2x minus 3. And you might be saying to yourself now, how are you going to determine which of these points is on this line? And I'm simply going to use a little XY chart to do that. And our X values are already selected for us, right? Again, these are all of our X values. So let's start with negative 1. We know X is negative 1. So let's plug it into our equation of our line here and see what we get as Y. This becomes Y equals 2 times negative 1 minus 3. Y equals 2 times negative 1 is negative 2 minus 3. Y equals negative 5. So the point negative 1, negative 5 is on our line. Negative 1, positive 1 is not on our line. All right, let's move on. Again, this says X is 0. Let's plug 0 into our equation of our line. This says Y equals 2 times 0 minus 3. Y equals 2 times 0 is 0, so Y equals negative 3. So the point 0, negative 3 is on the line, not 0, 6. All right, let's do the same thing here. This is positive 1 for X. And let's go ahead and plug positive 1 into our equation of our line. This says Y equals 2 times positive 1 minus 3. Y equals 2 times positive 1 is 2 minus 3. Y equals 2 minus 3 is negative 1. So the point 1, negative 1 is on this line. And since we see that C is positive 1, negative 1, we know that this point is on our equation of our line. And we found that by plugging it into our equation of our line. So that is that one. We don't even have to check D at this point. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says, what is the value of X if 3/5 X minus 12 equals 15? Again, since you're not permitted to use a calculator or a reference sheet on the actual Asvab or Piquet, you want to get in the habit of copying things down on your own scratch paper. In this case, we're going to be solving this equation, and the first thing I'm going to do is add 12 to both sides. In doing so, this crosses out, leaving us with 3/5 X equals 15 plus 12 is going to be 27. All right, to clear this 3/5 in front of X, we're going to multiply both sides of this equation by the reciprocal of 3/5, which is going to be 5/3. In doing so, these cross out here and here, leaving you with X on this side. What is 27 times 5/3? We'll write 27 as a fraction by placing it over 1. Then you can simply cross-reduce to make this math much easier. 3 goes into 3 one time, 3 goes into 27 9 times. This becomes 9/1, which is just 9. Again, 9 divided by 1 is 9, times 5/1. 5 divided by 1 is 5. 9 times 5, of course, is 45. So the answer to this one is A. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says, what is a circle's diameter if its area is 25 pi square inches? So in order to solve this one, you first have to know how to find the area of a circle. Again, since you're not permitted to use a calculator or a reference sheet on the actual Asvab or Piquet, you do have to commit this formula to memory at some point. Area of a circle is given by the formula area equals pi r squared, where r is the radius. In this case, we know the area is 25 pi, so I'm going to replace this a with 25 pi equals pi r squared. And we're going to solve this equation for r. So to get started, I'm going to divide both sides of this equation by pi. In doing so, this crosses out, leaving me with r squared over here. This crosses out as well, leaving me with 25 over here. Now again, I want to solve this equation for r, not r squared. So to get rid of this squared on this r, I'm going to do the opposite operation. That is to say, I'm going to take the square root of both sides of this equation. In doing so, this crosses out, leaving me with r over here. The square root of 25 is 5. So now we know the radius of this circle. That said, you have to know that there is a relationship between the diameter and radius of every circle. More specifically, the diameter is always equal to twice the length of the radius, and you can see that illustrated here. In other words, d equals 2r. We know what r is, so let's go ahead and plug it in. This becomes d equals 2 times 5, d equals 10. So the diameter of this circle, which has a radius of 5 and an area of 25 pi, is going to be d 10 inches. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says 1/4 divided by 2/7 is the same as. So since the Asvab and Piquet are computer adaptive tests, you should expect to get questions that are as easy as this one in the very beginning of the test. In order to get to the harder questions and ultimately a high score on the test, you have to be able to answer these easy questions correctly. And in this case, what are we doing? We're dividing two fractions. When you divide two fractions, you follow the algorithm keep, change, flip. That is to say, you keep the first fraction the same, so we're going to keep 1/4 as is. You change from division to multiplication, and then you flip the second fraction. So instead of being 2/7, it's going to be 7/2. In other words, 1/4 divided by 2/7 is the same thing as 1/4 times 7/2, which we can see is answer choice D in this case. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says x squared times x to the 4th times x to the -3rd equals. So we're going to work on simplifying this expression, but as a quick reminder, you do not get a reference sheet on the Asvab or Piquet. So in that case, you want to copy these questions down and get in the habit of working them out on your own scratch paper. Now, the first thing I want to do to simplify this expression is make this exponent of -3 positive. when you have a negative exponent, you can make it positive by moving it into the denominator of your expression. So let's do that. This will become x squared times x to the fourth over x to the third. And you see that our exponent became positive. All right, so let's work on simplifying this numerator now. And to do that, we're going to use one of the laws of exponents called the product rule. The product rule says this: if you have a to the m times a to the n, that's equal to a to the m plus n. That is to say, you add their exponents. And in this case, we have x squared times x to the fourth. This is going to become x to the 2 plus 4, which is x to the 6th. So this becomes x to the 6th over x to the third. All right, now to simplify this expression further, we're going to use another law of exponents called the quotient rule. And that says if you have a to the m over a to the n, you subtract their exponents, so this becomes a to the m minus n. And in this case, we have x to the 6th over x to the third. This is going to become x to the 6 minus 3. 6 minus 3 is 3. So this becomes x to the third, which is answer choice B. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says, what is the solution to the system of equations 3y plus 3x equals 24, 6y minus 3x equals 39? So more often than not, people solve system of equations using one of two methods. That is, they use the substitution method or the elimination method. And the elimination method says multiply either one or both equations by a constant, such that when you add them together, one of the letter variables is eliminated. That said, if we look at our system here, what happens if we just add the two equations together? What is 3x plus negative 3x? It's eliminated, so that's all we have to do in this case. 3y plus 6y is 9y. 3x plus negative 3x, this is eliminated, equals 24 plus 39 is 63. To solve for y, we just divide both sides of this equation by 9. In doing so, this crosses out. 63 divided by 9 is 7. Again, solutions to systems of equations can be written as ordered pairs, and ordered pairs come in the form x, y. We know y equals 7, so it's going to go here. Now the question is, how do we solve x? Well, we know y equals 7. So we can take this 7, plug it into either of the two original equations, that is, either one of these, for y, and then solve for x accordingly. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do it with this first equation. This becomes 3. Again, y is 7, plus 3x equals 24. 3 times 7 is 21, plus 3x equals 24. Subtract 21 from both sides of the equation. This crosses out, leaving us with 3x over here. 24 minus 21 is 3. Divide both sides by 3 to get x by itself. This says x equals 3 over 3 is 1. X is 1. So our solution to this system is going to be 1, 7, which is answer choice B, of course. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says, given the following inequality, which of the statements below could be true? So we have the inequality negative 5x plus 3 greater than negative 4x minus 5. Now, regarding inequalities, here's the one rule you need to know. Whenever you multiply or divide across the inequality sign by a negative value, that's going to prompt you to change the direction of the sign. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and solve this one. I'm going to get started by adding 4x to both sides of the inequality. In doing so, this crosses out, leaving us with negative 5 over here. Negative 5x plus 4x is going to be negative x. Now I'm going to move 3 to the other side of the inequality via subtraction. In doing so, this crosses out, leaving me with negative x greater than negative 5 minus 3 is negative 8. And finally, we want to solve this for x, not negative x. So in order to get x by itself, I'm going to divide both sides of this inequality by a negative 1. I just divided across the inequality sign by a negative value.
Get your Bible. You get it?
Yeah.
Greater than -5 minus 3 is -8. And finally, we want to solve this for x, not -x. So in order to get x by itself, I'm going to divide both sides of this inequality by a -1. I just divided across the inequality sign by a negative value. So that's going to prompt me to change the direction of the inequality sign, which you can see I just did. Negative divided by a negative is a positive. So negative x divided by -1 is just going to be x. Negative divided by a negative is going to be a positive. So -8 divided by -1 is going to be 8. This says x is all the values that are less than 8, and you can quickly graph this one if it makes it easier to understand. Let's go to 8 here, and this would be 7, this would be 6, this would be we have a less than symbol, so we're going to put an open circle above 8 to indicate that we don't include 8 in our solution, and x is all the values that are less than 8. And we can see that that's going to include 7, 6, and so on. So to answer this one, x equals 7 is a true statement given this inequality. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says, if x plus 1 equals 3, then x equals. And some of you might be saying to yourself, Grammar Hero, why are you posting a question that's this easy? And I just want to remind you that the Asvab and Piquet are both computer adaptive tests. That means in the very beginning of the test, you're going to get questions that are as easy as this one. You want to make sure that, especially in the beginning of the test, you get these easy questions right, because these easy questions are the key that will unlock harder questions in the second half of the test and ultimately unlock a higher score for you. So in this case, we have a one-step equation to solve it. We're just going to subtract 1 from both sides. It says x equals 3 minus 1, which is 2. So this one is 2. If you want to quickly check your work, you can. You know, x equals 2, so plug it in right here and see if this makes a true statement. This becomes 2 plus 1 equals 3. Does 3 equal 3? It does. Therefore, we're confident that we solved this one-step equation correctly. Again, you have to get the easy questions right in the beginning of the test in order to unlock the harder questions later on and in order to achieve a higher score on the test. So take the first few questions very seriously. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says if a equals negative 5, then a squared minus 9 equals. In other words, we're going to be evaluating the expression a squared minus 9 when a equals negative 5. In other words, we're going to plug in negative 5 for a and evaluate accordingly. Now, when you plug in negative 5, you want to make sure you do it correctly. In this case, I'm going to use a set of parentheses to indicate that the negative is also going to be squared. So this is negative 5 squared minus 9. What is negative 5 squared? Negative 5 squared is the same thing as negative 5 times negative 5. Negative times a negative is going to be a positive. More specifically, negative 5 times negative 5 is going to be positive 25. So this is 25 minus 9, which most of you can do mentally. That's going to be 16. So this one is C. If you couldn't do this part mentally, you could always do it off to the side. 25 minus 9. 5 minus 9 we can't do. We borrow. This becomes 1. This becomes 15. 15 minus 9 is 6. And just drop down this 1. So that is that one. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says factor a cubed minus b cubed. That is, we're trying to factor the difference of 2 cubes. Now there's 2 ways you can go about solving this one. You can multiply all your answer choices out until you get this expression, or you could go to my website, asvabapp.com. And if you did that, you can download a free copy of my reference sheet. And toward the back of that reference sheet, you'll see that I have a factoring guide where I discuss how to factor the difference of the sum and difference of cubes. In this case, being asked to factor the difference of a cubed minus b cubed. That is the difference of 2 cubes. So we're simply just going to copy this down as is. You should have this pattern memorized for this test. Even if you forget it right after the test, that'd be fine. But this is simply going to be a minus b times a squared plus a times b plus b squared. And that is it. So this one is clearly going to be answer choice A. Again, there are 2 ways to solve this one. You can multiply all the answer choices out, or you can simply memorize these patterns for factoring the sum and difference of cubes. This math knowledge practice test question for the Asvab and Piquet says, what is the result of subtracting 3x squared minus 5x minus 1 from 8x squared plus 2x plus 9? So we're subtracting this polynomial from this polynomial, and the way we set it up is like this. We have 8x squared plus 2x plus 9, and from that we're subtracting this entire polynomial. So we have to use a set of parentheses. It's going to be 3x squared minus 5x minus 1. Now we're going to take this negative sign and we're going to distribute it to each of these terms in this polynomial here, like so. So this becomes 8x squared plus 2x plus 9 3x squared is going to be negative 3x squared. A negative times a negative is going to be a positive, so negative times negative 5x is going to be positive 5x. And then finally, a negative times a negative is going to be a positive, so negative times negative 1 is going to be positive 1. Now, all we have to do is simplify